Officials of the ANC feel very strongly that Tito Mboweni was becoming too big for his boots. There was a strong feeling that there were other people who could do this job. If he didn't think he was bigger than the ANC, he wouldn't be in this trouble. That's actually an excerpt from a 2009 Mail and Guardian article after Mboweni's contract as Reserve Bank governor was not renewed. The article goes on to highlight the collision course that Mboweni was on with the tripartite alliance at the time. After this week's medium-term budget policy statement, could Mboweni stoke old fires? He's bold enough to tell the ANC and its alliance partners no. The Politbureau is now in session. I'm Aldrin Sampear. The Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, rejoins mainstream politics at a very delicate time. It's an election year. It's one of the periods where we have seen in the past that COSATU would throw its weight around because of the financial injection it gives the ANC's election campaign. At the same time, the SACP is flirting with the idea of contesting state power. How does President Cyril Ramaphosa balance what the Finance Minister believes the country needs versus what the ANC alliance wants? Joining me to unpack this aspect of the re-emergence of Tito Mboweni is Business Times columnist Hilary Joffe, as well as Wits Associate Professor Chris Malikane. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks. Let's just quickly listen to Tito Mboweni.
We must repair damaged government institutions as their failure impacts on poorer households the most. There have been governance challenges at key state institutions. This we have to deal with. State institutions are being repaired and renewed. There's a background. State-owned enterprises are being reconfigured, as we have said. The President has initiated a plan that will support our economic recovery plan.
Hilary, do you think that the minister is making all the right noises when it comes to SOEs?
He doesn't have a lot of alternative. The SOEs are really broken and they need to be fixed. And he is talking about reconfiguring them and no holy cows, and we have to look at all options. And indeed we do, because they really are broken. Not only financially, Eskom is to all intents and purposes bankrupt. He had to bail a few of the others. But also operationally, where clearly things are not working and something needs to happen. So I don't think he's saying anything we don't know. I think the issue is, what are we going to do about it?
But does reconfiguration mean privatize? Or privatize a bit of it?
I know that's the dirty word,
yeah.
and that is why I suppose government people are reluctant to say it. And really, I don't think it's about ownership. It's about who can fund these entities, who can fix these entities, what needs to be done, for example, to the cost base of an Eskom, whether it's the coal costs or the personnel costs or the operating costs generally, to somehow line it up with the fact that we've got lower electricity demand in the country, and we will have for the foreseeable. And it can't afford to keep taking on more and more debt to build power stations which the country may not need.
Professor Chris, do you think that this actually means that we should be privatizing, also taking into consideration a tweet that he once sent out a couple of months ago where he said he believes that about 60% of the South African airways should be privatized?
Well, that's what he thinks. And actually, he, in the budget policy statement, he mentions public-private partnerships, increasing private equity in state-owned enterprises. So when we talk about these big words like reconfiguration, restructuring, it is nothing but introducing the private sector in the state-owned entities. There was once talk that the debt that is with the state entities has to be converted into equity, which is a means of privatization and offloading of public infrastructure to private sector to fund and own and price, so that it generates a rate of return for the private sector. It's a means of privatizing government functions.
But the environment that he finds himself in, like this re-emergence of Tito Mboweni, it's pretty volatile right now. As I've indicated, that there's an election year, and of course you have the Labour Federation playing a big role in the ANC's campaign, and they've already said that we reject this aspect.
Yes, it's funny because the Labour Federation supported the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa, who is a business person well known. And of course, his presidency represents the rise and the reassertion of the power of what I call white monopoly capital in the South African economy. It's a fact. We need to be frank about that.
Do you still stick by that?
Yes, of course, because reality is that historically, and we all know the South African economy was dominated by monopolies and continue to be dominated by multinational monopolies. South African original monopolies have internationalized their ownership, but they still remain white controlled, white managed, and white owned.
And Hillary, interesting that the Prof should say that, because earlier on, just before the show, we spoke about what the President said during the dinner this past weekend, that let's shift away from this idea of white monopoly capital.
I think the investment conference on Friday was really very interesting because it showcased what the private sector was already doing, as well as the new investments that private investors are prepared to commit to. Domestic primarily, but also international. And why that's important is I think we often don't notice how much investing the private sector actually does. It leads investment in the economy. It accounts for 2/3 of investment. So you can talk about what SOEs are doing in terms of infrastructure, but the bedrock of investment in this economy and the bedrock of employment is the private sector. So that's reality. So if you're going to get more of it, more investment, more jobs, that's really where it's going to come from, especially since the government basically has no money, and the really bad figures in the medium-term budget, I think, highlight that. So what was interesting about, one of the many interesting things about Friday's investment conference is I think the President was talking to his own constituency, including the likes of Professor Malikane here. And he was saying, look what the private sector is doing, white or black. I mean, I don't think it's such a racial thing, frankly. Again, ownership is not particularly relevant, but I mean, it is in the context of the need to transform the economy, but in the need of in terms of what the private sector is actually doing, whether it's black or white, the point is it is investing huge amounts, and it should be investing much more. And if we can inspire confidence, that's what's going to lead growth and job creation. And I think what the President was saying is, he said, look at what all these people are announcing, and they all came up to the stage and they announced, some of it was actually stay in business, investment, some of it was new investment. Look at what the private sector is doing. The investment strike that you guys have been talking about isn't there. What is this white monopoly capital stuff? It's kind of a bit of a myth.
Professor Malikane, I just want to go back to this report that you penned last year. And speaking about investors and the role that investors play, do you at all believe, and in this report you indicate that there was a shift away from the ANC and having power when it comes to appointing ministers, especially in the economic cluster. Do you think that there has been a reversal?
Yeah, well, there's been no reversal in that sense. In fact, the appointment of Tito Mboweni reinforces what I've always said, that the white monopoly capital in South Africa would want a finance minister and a governor that they can have confidence in. And we must remember that the Minister of Finance is in charge of the tax system, which affects the bottom line, is in charge of macroeconomic policy. The Governor of the Reserve Bank is in charge of the overall macroeconomic environment, and they also monitor the inflows and outflows of cash in the South African system, in the economy. So you need people there that can advance the interest, their interest, because those portfolios.
Whose interest does the minister advance?
I mean, we know that when he was governor of the Reserve Bank, he never advanced the interest of the working class. Kosatu has been calling for a change in macroeconomic policy, and he has been steadfast on inflation targeting, supported by Trevor Manuel, who was then Minister of Finance, and Jill Marcus, and Trevor Manuel's wife, who was then the DG of Treasury.
Do you agree with that?
I disagree. Look, I do agree that as Governor, Mr. Mboweni did not do a very good job of consulting and getting people on board, and really, in the end, I think his personality really alienated quite a lot of constituencies. And when Jill Marcus came in, she brought those people back into at least talking to the bank. But I really do think that it's that to say that he did not serve the interests of the working class is just plain wrong. Under inflation targeting, and perhaps any central bank governor would have done the same, but Mr. Mboweni did it pretty well, Governor Mboweni, inflation fell sustainably from the double digits, which we'd become used to in South Africa, to single digits, and, coming down. We now look at 5 and 6%. When I was growing up, 20% was not unusual in inflation. Now, that hurts the poor. that means that poor people, when they go and buy a loaf of bread tomorrow, find that it's 20%, or next year, find it's 20% more expensive.
And I think
it's hard to imagine that high inflation, runaway inflation, can possibly be good for poor people. Rich people can probably cope because they get, they have savings.
Professor Malikane, I see you burning to it.
Poor people can't cope with high inflation.
There is a standard distortion and caricaturing of the position of COSATU and the working class. The working class is not saying that we want runaway inflation. What the working class is saying is that we need at least dual mandate.
Dual target.
Yes, we need to target the rate of unemployment and the price stability. So it's already happening. I mean, you look at the Bank of New Zealand that pioneered inflation targeting. It has shifted towards unemployment targeting, actually.
Our bank would call itself a flexible inflation targeter. And if you look at the language of monetary policy committees, it does keep an eye to growth and monetary policy. And frankly, I'm not sure that lower interest rates would give us more growth. I think that growth is to be found in a more... In changing the economy in more fundamental ways. But I want to give you one example, Aldrin, of where high inflation, high interest rates, uncertainty about the country do really matter. And that's if we go back to the budget. Now, if investors are expecting that the risk is going to be high and inflation is going to be high, they charge more to buy the country's bonds and the state-owned enterprises bonds. And what the budget documents tell us is that interest costs, in other words, just the interest we're paying on the government debt, is going up. It's gone up from about 6% 10 years ago of the tax that government collects, now to about 13, 14%. And in the next few years, it's going to be 15% of every rand in tax the government collects is going to go just to pay for the 200 billion, the sort of 2 trillion rand of debt that the country has. So that's not good.
Let's just quickly move on in this one. And Professor Malikane, do you believe that nationalizing the Reserve Bank would allow South Africa to have that discussion of a dual targeting, for instance? Also taking into consideration that the minister said hands off the Reserve Bank, while the ANC has resolved and said actually nationalize, and that process has already started in terms of consultation.
I think we need to make a distinction between ownership of the Reserve Bank, which is about control of the Reserve Bank's balance sheet, ownership of assets and liabilities of the Reserve Bank. That's what nationalization of the Reserve Bank is about, as distinct from the mandate of the Reserve Bank. We can change the mandate of the Reserve Bank without nationalizing it. So there are two things here. But changing the mandate of the Reserve Bank means that we need to go to the Constitution and broaden the mandate of the Reserve Bank and change the Constitution. So in my view, I think that whilst we're talking about the Constitution, we need to look at the mandate of the Reserve Bank and its ownership simultaneously so that we just have a seamless process. So that's my view. We need to change the mandate of the Reserve Bank to align. I mean, look at the mandate of the Fed. It's flexible inflation targeting, but the mandate is clear. Target price stability and maximum sustainable employment. Flexible inflation targeting as well was in New Zealand, but New Zealand is now being explicit to say target maximum sustainable employment.
Okay then, thank you so much guys for this discussion. This is Hilary Joffe, the Business Times columnist, as well as Professor Malikane. Professor Malikane, just a quick one before I let you go. If you were still advisor to the minister, well, this particular minister, finance minister, what would you say the first thing is that he should do?
He needs to review the manner in which he finances his budget. I don't think that government going to the private sector to raise debt, to finance development is a sustainable way to go. That's why the interest costs are so high. Government needs to have in place prescribed assets. He needs to proceed to set up his sovereign wealth fund. He needs to proceed, as he proposed in Twitter, to say that the state must have a significant ownership of the mining sector to build the sovereign wealth fund.
But does he have the time, Hilary, to do that, considering that the elections are coming up? This cabinet might just change.
The private sector is going to pay one way or the other, whether it funds it through debt or it provides the debt or it provides the taxes. So the thing to do is to get the economy to grow and incentivize the private sector to invest and to grow and to create jobs. And that really, the question that we need to look at macroeconomic policy for is, how are we going to do that?
Definitely how we're going to do it. Thank you guys so much for your time. Well, after the break, we discussed Tito Mboweni, the guy from the early 90s, the class of 1996, and we will be joined by Zwelinzima Vavi. It should be an interesting discussion.